U.S. President-elect Donald Trump says he's not afraid of Ontario's threat to cut off the province's energy supply to the United States.
We will go to the extent of cutting off their energy, going down to Michigan, going down to New York State and over to Wisconsin.
Well, that's okay if he does that, that's fine, but the United States is subsidizing Canada. It's truly a subsidy, and we shouldn't have to do that.
Premier Doug Ford says his takeaway from Trump's response is the president's desire to reach a deal.
I respect the position he's coming from, and I'm sure he respects the position we're coming from. As he also mentioned, he has lots of friends in Canada. Well, we have lots of friends in the U.S. That's the reason we need to make a deal.
Well, if there is no deal and no deal is reached, will Ontario follow through on their threats? Stephen Lecce is the Ontario Government Minister of Energy and Electrification, and he joins me now. Minister, it's good to see you again. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
This threat the Premier made the other day, I mean, just how far is your government prepared to go with cutting off the energy supply to the key states, and for how long?
The preference of the Premier is that the national government's able to secure a deal for Canada and for the U.S. that's good for both economies, protects our borders, and obviously keeps the free flow of trade between our integrated sectors. I mean, 9 million Americans will wake up on Monday depending on this relationship. So we want a deal. That is clearly the preference of all of us to avoid the tariff. But the Premier is saying, look, if the President-elect proceeds with this unprecedented 25% tariff, then all the provinces need to build their own lists according to their own economic interests. The Premier is serious that we have to be ready to respond. The President-elect's psychology, I think we could agree, is that he responds to strength. And so let's have a credible plan, a tough plan that will ensure some sort of retaliatory nature to this type of tariff. And we have different levers in Ontario than other parts of Canada do. We do sell excess energy into the US. It is something we could do, and it would affect 1.5 million Americans in key battleground states of Michigan and New York and obviously Wisconsin. So we want to avoid this. And we think there's a path for the national government to do that by increasing defense spending and hitting 2% and protecting our borders and safeguarding them from the illegal flow of drugs and people. But if they proceed, the message, David, is we've got to be ready with the plan.
Well, the Premier said the other day he thinks they're coming 100%. You're going to see these tariffs January 20th or January 21st. So this is why he's putting things like this on the table. He also had calls at the governors of Michigan and New York yesterday. What have you heard from the governors of these states about what the Premier has threatened to do here?
Well, the Premier mentioned that they were actually very productive calls and very positive in their tone. And what he indicated even just today is that those governors understood where Ontario is coming from. They may disagree, but there was an understanding of why we need to do this. Obviously, the preference of the Premier when he's working with the governors of Michigan and New York, when I'm working with the secretaries of energy, we want to sell more energy into the U.S. market. We actually believe we can monetize this incredible asset. We're producing so much energy in Ontario that we currently are a net exporter. We want to double down on that so that we can bring more jobs and revenue back home and help them with their energy transition because they want cleaner forms of energy, as many of these states still burn coal. So our objective is actually to lean in to expand our trade relationship. But in the meantime, we've got to put on the table some serious options, some tools we can invoke should they proceed with this tariff.
Right, but
we do think, though.
Well, the Premier said this is a last resort, right? And I know, look, everyone wants a negotiated settlement to this so that there aren't any tariffs. But the Premier said this is a last resort, while at the same time saying he is certain that these tariffs are going to be imposed. So at what point do you trigger the last resort? Is it the day that the tariffs go up? Is it a week? Is it a month into it? Like, how soon do you move on something this dramatic if he does what would be even more dramatic on the U.S. side of things?
Yeah. We are going to be ready to implement our plan as soon as any tariff can be implemented. So January 20th or thereafter, we'll be ready to respond if we must. But, we want to take a different approach in this negotiation. I mean, we would prefer for the Canadian governments to sign a deal that averts this. And I think a critical message that is resonating in the U.S. market is that we are the only jurisdiction in the Western Hemisphere that has all of the critical minerals to build the EV and the batteries. I mean, we have 24 of 50 of the critical minerals on the U.S. critical minerals strategy. And I think this is really important because we've got the lithium and the cobalt and the other rare earths that are now so difficult to find. And it's either China or increasingly Democratic Ontario or Canada. And we're trying to remind the US it is in their national security interest. It's why the Premier led with a ad program in the US. You don't see the national government doing this or other provinces yet. You see Ontario with that first mover's advantage. You can't go to an airport in America without seeing a program, an ad that really speaks about the value of this shared relationship, the economic value, the jobs in the US, the 9 million people that wake up, and the fact that we share their democratic values. So we're going to continue to take a positive approach to this, but we will be ready, and we've got to be ready to stand up for our jobs. I mean, what is the alternative? We just take this tariff and don't respond? The last time President Trump imposed tariffs on the people of Canada, our country responded with targeted approach that actually had impact. And the Premier spoke about bourbon and alcohol and other levers that we have. Look, we're the subnational government. We don't have all the options like the feds, but we have some, and we're going to use them if we have to defend our province and to send a message to the U.S. that we're just not going to take this lightly.
Okay, no, look, and the federal government, my conversations, I'm sure the Premier's gotten some indication of this. They are working on something. They're going a little bit slower and lower key than your boss is at this point. A bit of a good cop, bad cop, perhaps, is how it's playing out. But I want to go back to something you said about being ready to go the minute the tariffs go up. I know you're looking at things like not putting American liquor in the LCBOs and other things like this. But on the power threat, does that mean you're ready to cut the power supply the minute the tariffs happen? Does that mean Michigan, New York, Wisconsin, these things lose access to Ontario energy the minute Donald Trump moves on a tariff?
We'll provide more details as we get closer to the 20th, really just based on the political circumstance on the ground. But the Premier has indicated we will be ready to do so if we must, to respond and make sure we send a clear message that we will defend and speak up and stand up for Canadian jobs in Ontario manufacturing and supply chain. So, the timing, the details, all of this will come in time. We still have some weeks to avoid this, and the federal government can announce their program on the border and on the military spending that I think can help avert a tariff. But yes, we will be ready, and it can be implemented as soon as day one if that is the decision of the Premier, the cabinet, and obviously of the country, because we're taking a team approach to this. Each province has taken a bit of a different approach to building their lists, but we want to coordinate this and obviously work with the feds because they are the primary intermediary negotiator with the Americans and the incoming president-elect.
But I just want to make sure I'm not misunderstanding you, because I don't want to mischaracterize this in any other coverage you do or what people write off your comments here. You're planning to be ready to cut the power to these states on day one of a Trump-imposed tariff. Like that is the preparation Ontario is taking right now. That you say it's a last resort, but the last resort kicks in if Trump makes good on his threat. You're ready to turn off the power.
It can be one of the options the province can invoke. The Premier said it's something that is on the table. And obviously, as we get closer to January 20th, we can unveil with greater precision the timing of those things. But the Premier's been also very clear he wants to avoid that scenario. In the meantime, while we hope to avoid the tariff and the federal proposal on borders and defense spending is robust and I think mutually accepted upon by both governments, hopefully we don't have to go there. But if we do, what I'm committing to you and the Premier is committed to is building out our list. It can include things like the LCBO, the largest alcohol purchaser on earth. It can include energy exports. It can include a series of retaliatory actions that send a message that we're just not going to take this lightly, and we're going to stand up for our workforce and for our economy. But in the meantime, the Premier is taking, I think, a proactive and frankly a more aggressive posture by working with the U.S. and with administrators, with governors, and yes, with Republican and Democratic leaders in the House and Senate to try to dissuade them on the imposition of this tariff and get to President Trump, get into his to his advisors, and really make the case that between the critical minerals and yes, the net power we're selling, the clean, affordable power we're selling, the 9 million jobs, and the series of other national security benefits that come with our relationship, we really hope we can avoid this because, as the Premier has noted, everyone loses in these trade wars, and I think we'd rather make the case that we're stronger together as a continental Can-Am approach to economic development that has served families in America and Canada, particularly in Ontario, very well for generations.
No, there's no question it's a lose-lose economically if it comes to this, and I think anybody with a firm grasp of trade and economics understands that. But just as a last quick point, Minister, Trump, I'm sure you saw this clip, he was asked about this on the floor of the stock exchange by CNBC about Premier Ford's energy threat, and he said, That's fine. Go ahead and do it, basically, is what he said. What's your response to that as a final point?
Well, he also then said, we've got a good relationship with Canada. We want to get a deal, and then made some other comments about the trade imbalance in his observation. So he did indicate that he wants to get a deal, and that's really the first time I've heard him say that in recent weeks, and that's promising. And the Premier acknowledges that that is a good sign, that he is suggesting that he's got good relations with Canadians. He knows many people here. He wants to get a deal. Wonderful. Right. Let's leverage that goodwill and secure a deal with the Canadian government, who's leading this negotiation, putting some pretty serious proposals on the table that should help remediate the problems and the irritants between the two countries. But, look, at the end of the day, we have to be very clear-minded that if this tariff comes, we as a country must respond in kind. Right. And as well, while that is ongoing and while we continue to work to avert it, we're going to continue to make the case to the Americans that the southern border is not the northern border. I mean, the southern border, we're seeing a significant amount of transshipment of cheap Chinese goods coming through the Mexican border. That is not the case in Ontario. We have a very different political situation, north versus south, when it comes to migrants, et cetera. So we want to get those facts out to American decision makers, and we're going to continue to work the phones. We're heading, we'll be in America often over the coming weeks to really lead in and drive the message that our countries are better together.
Ontario Minister of Energy and Electrification, Stephen Lecce. Always good to speak with you, sir. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks, David.